In the lonely skies over Reykjavik in distant Iceland, Norway's exiled air force rises to meet the Nazi threat. It is March of 1940, and the early battles of World War II are raging. The Royal Norwegian Naval Air Service orders 24 Northrop N-3PB patrol bombers to replace their aging MF-11 biplanes. This is the first aircraft designed by the newly formed Northrop Aircraft Incorporated. But before they can be delivered from the United States, disaster strikes. Norway is invaded by Nazi Germany, and in the face of overwhelming superiority, capitulation is quick. Pilots scramble frantically to evacuate what remains of Norway's aircraft to Sweden, Finland, and most of all, Great Britain. Those who manage to escape the occupation flee to England, where they nurse their anger and plot revenge. These Norwegian exiles form No. 330 Squadron in Reykjavik, now trusted with the same Northrop aircraft that were destined for the Navy Air Service. Though nominally under RAF command, the squadron is staffed exclusively by Norwegians. Their primary duty is to escort the Canadian and American convoys, which cross the vast reaches of the North Atlantic. At this point, the U-boat threat is at its greatest, and Nazi wolf packs prowl the ocean, preying on unguarded supply ships destined for Britain and the USSR. And for this, the N-3PB is well suited. A single Wright Cyclone 1200 horsepower engine gives it a range of 1,400 miles, enough to patrol the shipping routes of the icy Atlantic. 30 and 50 caliber machine guns help keep it safe from the Luftwaffe fighters, and 2,000 pounds of bombs stand ready to sink attacking ships of the Kriegsmarine. The crew consists of a pilot, navigator, and radio operator. 3 flights are established in Reykjavik, Akureyri, and Budareyri, each flying 4 planes. The Norwegian government in exile pays for the upkeep and maintenance costs, and their squadrons are soon re-equipped with short Sunderlands and de Havilland Mosquitoes. By the time all is said and done, Norwegian squadrons No. 330 and 333 have made a valiant contribution to winning the war and liberating their homeland.
There we are. This is just the beginning clip, a tease of a new full-length theatrical documentary that premiered just several days ago in England to overwhelming success, and premiered Monday night for the first time here in the United States at Theater in the Woods the other night. These two gentlemen with me, David Fairhead on the left, a co-director of the film, and to his left, John Dibbs, who is a cinematographer who shot all that gorgeous film, and he's a co-producer of the movie. Thank you. So, gentlemen, start us off. Where did the idea come from to do a full-length documentary about the Spitfire, and why now?
Well, the idea happened, like all the best ideas, at the pub, where my great friend Anthony Palmer, who I've known for 20 years, came to me and said, I've got one word for you, Spitfire. What do you think of it for a film? And I said yes, and that's why we're here, 3.5 years later. But a year into that, length of time, we started filming interviews with the veterans, but we really wanted to have some, footage to illustrate the story of the Spitfire, and we entertained ideas of using CGI and everything. And then I stumbled across this man here. I found some footage of his on the web, and I knew his name because my dad's got his calendars on the wall at home, but I didn't know he shot moving footage, and it was so different and so outstanding, and I thought, well, if we're going to have air-to-air material, this is the... I got in touch with John, and to cut the long story short, he said, I'm in.
John, you started, as he suggested, as a still photographer, right?
Yes.
How much still photography did you do before you turned to doing motion picture photography?
Well, my first sortie was in 1989. So I've flown almost 1,300 air-to-air still sorties in 133 different types of aircraft. So I do everything from private aeroplanes to 747s, Concords. Warbirds is one of my big things, and also flown an awful lot with the modern military. So I fly with the Royal Air Force and the US Air Force. And but one of the things that we do as the Plane Picture Company, which is the company that we operate under, is we used to shoot video for corporate clients, so we did some moving image, but it was never with warbirds or anything like that. So I had experience in that, but hadn't brought it to my passion, which is the warbirds.
I saw a picture of an F-35. Did you take that photograph that I saw inside?
The F-22.
F-22,
yes,
excuse me.
Yeah. So I was lucky enough to be the first foreign national to be able to shoot the F-22, and it's so fascinating to see the difference in performance. I shot a 1918 SE-5A, an original RAF, or Royal Flying Corps SE-5A, that's 100 years old, all the way through to F-22s and Typhoons and things.
So what was your process now in deciding what you were going to write, what you were going to shoot, and build this documentary?
Well, it really, after that meeting in the pub, we realized we had to move very quickly, because the key to the whole story was really going to be the veterans, and they weren't getting any younger. So literally before we'd raised any budget, before we'd entertained about even filming the Spitfires, we thought, right, let's get these interviews in the can. So we contacted various people back in the UK and in the US actually, and we tried to set up interviews, and it was so timely, because in the period of time, 3.5 years that we've been making the film, over half of them have passed away. So literally, in some cases, these were the last interviews they ever gave, and they were in depth. They were, sometimes 3 or 4 hour long interviews with them from their very earliest interest in aviation right up to the present day. And it forms the backbone of the film. I mean, to give you an example of how close it was, we had the UK premiere 2 weeks ago, and within a week, two of our key interviewees had passed away after that point. And in fact, we've got a clip we can show you of one of these chaps, Jeffrey Wellham, who only passed away last week. So if you want to
let's
run
look at that. Scott, go ahead and roll the tape, would you please?
Yeah, so September the 15th is considered the victory day, but it carried.
How many of you saw the movie Dunkirk? Some. Oh, great. So you're all familiar with the Spitfire, but what we're going to learn from this documentary goes well beyond what we saw in the movie Dunkirk. How significant, Dibsy, is this airplane just in terms of protecting freedom around the world, not just for your country and our country, but all over the world?
It's hugely significant. I think, the aircraft was designed in 1935 by a very famous air racing a chap, R.J. Mitchell, who won the Schneider Trophy outright for the British. It was a competition between America, Italy, and various other nations. And he took what he learned from high-speed flight and built it into the Spitfire. And the Spitfire was very much ahead of its time. Its partner in crime, if you like, in the RAF was the Hurricane, but that was the best of the old technology. This was a leap forward. And the aeroplane, flew from Mark 1s through to Mark 24s. They built 24,000 of these. And
those are the different variants of
different variants. And, the airplane was 100 miles an hour faster at the end of the war than it was at the beginning. Oh. So it was an incredible platform in which to develop. But, it held the line in the earliest days of the war, and then was the mount of the famous Eagle squadrons, so the American volunteers that came over. It fought in Russia, it fought in so many different fronts all through the war. So, it's a symbol of freedom. That's it. It was an interceptor, so insofar as the fact that it maintained freedom for so many countries through the dark times of the Second World War.
Right. David, what's the plan for the movie now? Where is it going to be distributed? How can people find it?
It is released on Friday here in the US on digital platforms, Amazon, Google. You can pre-order it now on iTunes, and it'll be available across a whole range of different platforms. And if you're still here at the air show, there's an opportunity to see it again on Saturday afternoon or evening. I'm not quite sure, at the museum. There's limited seating, so if you want to go and see it on the big screen, book now. And I'd just like to say that it's been our privilege to make it, and it's been a great privilege to bring it here. And we've got a number of the producers here with us as well, including Steve Milne, British Film Company, and Gareth Dodds. So it's been fabulous. The screening on Monday night was an amazing opportunity to show it to a US audience, because it's a very Anglo-centric story, and yet the applause and the comments we got afterwards were really quite incredible. So I know that aviation enthusiasts love this aeroplane every bit as much as the Brits.
Ford Trimotor. Loud guy. To what extent do you recommend people try to see it on the big screen compared to with their computer screens?
Don't watch it on a computer screen or your phone. If you can see it on a large screen, and the bigger the screen, the better. It's a cinematic experience, and an awful lot of that is down to this man's work. He paints with light. He doesn't just take pictures of airplanes, and that combined with the absolutely amazing testimonies from the veterans, men and women. I hasten to point out, because women played a very, very important part in the story of this aircraft too. So if you can get to see it on a big screen, do. I know theatrical opportunities are limited in the US, but if you want to see it and you want to lobby your local cinemas to get it there, then lobby them and we'll see what we can do.
Good. Gentlemen, thank you so much. John, David, thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
David, could we just say that...
Sure.
If you're interested in the film... Because we undertook the filming for real, and you know, the producers that backed us to do this film, you know, I like to say that the Spitfire doesn't just fly on the elliptical wing, it flies on money as well. And it was the producers that came in, you know, the British Film Company and Havilland Digital, etc., who backed us to create this vision. But so we decided also to make a book about the making of the film. Wonderful. And we wanted the quotes from the veterans that speak in the film. We took their quotes and built them into a book. So it's the official companion book. And so there's a lot of air-to-air that I took that has never been seen before, a lot of restored and personal photos from the veterans with their words. And it's for sale in the shop after the presentation, beyond the 10 o'clock presentation at about 11 o'clock. And we'll be in there signing the book. Great. And when you read that book, in your own mind, you hear the veterans talking to you from the pages. So it's a very poignant and important book, I think, for documenting their experiences.
Wonderful, thank you. Now we're going to continue with our regular Spitfire program, and if you would turn back to the Jumbotron, and then we'll continue. Thank you all very much.
An jedem Tag nur zu denken an Deutschland, an Volk und an Reich, an unsere deutsche Nation und der deutsche Volk Sieg! Sieg! Sieg!
Adolf Hitler, the Führer, dictator of Nazi Germany, along with Mao and Stalin, one of the most evil killer leaders of the 20th century. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I. The treaty stripped defeated Germany of territory, of weapons, and what was left of its economy. Hitler was provoked to write his book, Mein Kampf, in English, My Struggle, where he laid out his plan for a new world order. His Nazi party would restore Germany and take over Europe.
You know, I was a young guy also in those days, but I think their aim was how to, by political measures, you know, get an improvement of the whole situation, means primarily economically, politically. And no member of any other party was idolized like Hitler in his party. He was a great leader, you know? And nothing, no word against him, no critique against him. What he said, this was right. Know that.
In 1933, he anointed himself Führer, leader, and dictator. Hitler demanded loyalty from every German. Not loyalty to their country, but to him, personally, by name.
First thing that was implemented by Hitler after he had taken to power was a Ministry of Propaganda. And under this ministry, all of the information industry had been centralized within half a year. That is, there was only one radio channel that was completely controlled by the Nazis, and all of the print industry, all newspapers, all magazines were under control of a censor that sat in the Ministry of Propaganda. It was strictly forbidden by law to listen to foreign radio stations, to radio stations outside Germany. So the first thing they tried was to limit the Germans' view on the outside world and make them think in the direction the Nazi Party had decided the people should think to. Hitler managed to reduce unemployment within 2 years to less than 1 million. So he was cheered upon like as if he had magical powers. And most of the people thought, well, this Jewish thing is really disgusting. But basically, he seems to be the right man at the right place.
in fiery speeches day and night to thousands, he preached two great evils, Judaism and communism. Over 6 years, Hitler built an overwhelmingly powerful and tactically brilliant military force, ground, sea, and air. He took over Austria and Czechoslovakia, then in 1939 invaded Poland. Within 3 months, he crushed 6 countries, controlled most of Western Europe, and was knocking on France's door. In the spring of 1940, the Germans surrounded nearly 340,000, mostly British and French, troops. Their only escape was from the shore of the port of Dunkirk in northwestern France. The water was extremely shallow, so British destroyers could not approach the beaches without running aground. Well, Prime Minister Winston Churchill mobilized every possible private boat, over 700 of them, to cross the English Channel from Ramsgate in eastern Britain to the rescue. Pleasure boats, yachts, fishing boats, any boat with a shallow draft to navigate the shallow water and ferry troops out to the waiting ships, or sail them back to England. Over 10 days that spring, they became known as the Little Ships of Dunkirk and saved more than 338,000 British and French troops to fight another day. And that day came very soon when the Germans began what became known as the Blitz, nearly 10 months of bombing Britain day and night, the Battle of Britain. Churchill, in one of his powerful radio talks, rallied his country. One hero of the Blitz was an airplane, the Spitfire. During the Blitz, British pilots shot down nearly 2,000 German aircraft and lost more than 1,000 of their own. Britain survived the Blitz. The Battle of Britain was one of the turning points of World War II. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your Spitfire crew. Gentlemen, join us.
I'm going next.
Hey. Yeah, I'm there.
Thanks, Dibsy. Yeah, thank you. And to introduce, from your far right, Matt Jones is the managing director of the Boltby Flight Academy in England. Next to him, Dave Hadfield, who has flown. How many hours do you have, Dave? About
27,000.
Oh, man.
Great.
And Dave flies all the old aircraft, but flew. How many times did you fly to China over the pole?
About 150.
Oh, so there's where those hours, those hours are, right? Dave Hadfield. And next to me, you've already met John Dibbs when we talked earlier about the documentary. When you look at that video, and we think about one airplane being so profoundly significant for freedom, as we talked about a few minutes ago, just how significant was this airplane in terms of protecting our freedoms?
I think it was everything, to be honest. You know, it depended on the people that built it, that designed it, and of course that flew it in combat, but it gave them the chance. These were very young men from the UK, from Canada, from the US as well. And with 120 hours total experience, you get in a Spitfire and realize it's not the most difficult aeroplane to fly, and it's because it talks to you when you're flying it. You don't have to worry about the pure aviation side. You can just look out. And in a combat situation, you can imagine a young chap getting into that aeroplane and thinking, yeah, I've got a chance with this. Yeah. And that's what they had.
Dave, you fly this airplane, yes?
Yes, and what was particularly valuable when it comes to defending freedom is both the engine and the airframe were capable of development. It was both a team and an engineering accomplishment. So as the war progressed, they were able to develop the engine and the airframe through all the different marks and make it a top-notch fighter airplane, defending democracy right to the end.
Right. Thinking about the 100th anniversary of the RAF, which is what we're commemorating here today, besides the Spitfire as an airplane, when you think back 100 years, how important was British aviation in World War I? Dibsy?
Well, I think that the Royal Flying Corps was the original incarnation of the British aviation war effort. So it was part of the army, and they fought from 1914 all the way through to 1918, and there were some incredible aircraft that were designed through that time and that they flew. Leading up, they went all the Sopwith machines that were Tommy Sopwith design, like the Camel and the Pup, and they matched really the German designs, which were very advanced at the time, that were coming into combat. And then ultimately the SE-5A, which was again a sort of a huge leap forward technologically, but you know, with the fact that the force grew so quickly and large, became so large that it was decided to make its own air arm. So in 1918, the Royal Air Force was born under its own auspices, so it could operate independently, and it was truly, rather than something that grew out of the tactical ground-based military thing with observation balloons and then aircraft, you know, it was then needed to be a force in its own right that was aviation with specific training. So that's where the birth of the RAF came around. And then, you know, obviously there was the British Empire, so which was all over the world. You know, the sun never set on the British Empire, as they say at that time. And so there were a lot of aircraft that were required and developed, and a large force was required to protect the various assets around the world and colonies and things like that. So, and there was a lot of technological developments, especially through the 30s with the rise. I think the RAF in particular was very aware of the rise of Hitler in Germany. So the air defense network that was built up by the Royal Air Force, with radar coming into play, you know, and the plotters and the cohesive air defense strategy, which proved key in Hitler's first defeat. You know, that was the first time Hitler hadn't won, was the Battle of Britain, and it was the first battle that was decided entirely in the air, the Battle of Britain, with the Spitfires and Hurricanes. So, you know, it's really important, I feel.
You know, how surprising, Dave, do you think it is that what we're talking about here, what Dibsy's talking about, is only 15 years after the Wright brothers? In 15 years, the amount of technological creativity that happened in those years just seems astounding.
Yes, there was an advancement in our whole civilization of engineering accomplishments, metallurgy, engineering, chemistry. And often in Britain at that time, they focused right at and led the cutting edge of it, honed the cutting edge, if you like. That Merlin, for example, was just a stunning achievement of supercharging, and you know, its predecessor, the racing engine from the SXB Schneider Cup winners, fuel technologies, cooling technologies, propeller technologies. The British teams that made that happen were the best in the world at the time. The Rolls-Royce Merlin was not originally sponsored by the government in any way. It was a private venture, the Private Venture 12. You know, the war clouds were gathering in Europe, and a group of engine industrialists decided we need a 1,000 horsepower engine to fight those people because they are going to be coming. And they developed that, you know, it was midway between the R engine, the racing engine, and the Kestrel, which was less power, and started that whole process on its own. And then they honed the engine. The Merlin wasn't successful at the beginning. There were many failures. And they would take engines off the production line at random, run them till they broke, find out what the problem was, fix it. So that by the time of the Battle of Britain, the pilots had to worry about tactics and gunnery, but not the engine, not the airframe.
Well, you have flown most of these tail draggers and old airplanes, yes?
I've flown a few.
A few. How do you see the development change in airplanes over time with just the planes that you've flown?
Well, I've flown some of the old biplanes, you know, the 1929 Waco Taper Wing and the 1931 de Havilland Foxmoth. And those are basically World War I mindset airplanes. And then it's the evolution that took place in the mid-30s, which was the most surprising. It's like space travel now. It's almost like they developed warp drive or something like that and just made a big leap.
Right. Matt, you're the youngest of us sitting here. When you listen to this talk about this amount of creativity, what goes through your mind as you now climb into a Spitfire and fly them?
It's such an emotional experience. You know, every flight that any of us are lucky enough to do these days, we do on behalf and to commemorate anyone who flew them on the day. And like I mentioned earlier, it was and as Dave was saying, you know, technology was at its peak at that point. And we're not just commemorating the pilots, we're commemorating the people who made all of these incredible advancements to make what was possible, or what happened possible, which in everyone's eyes really wasn't at the time.
So in the film we talk about the Battle of Britain, and you've both mentioned the Battle of Britain. Tell us, anyone, about the Battle of Britain. How did it start? And there occasionally read historically that the generals, the German generals, disagreed with Hitler, and they wanted to invade England. Have you all heard that or read that? And he said, no, let's do it in the air.
Well, I think the Battle of Britain, after France fell and the Low Countries fell and became occupied by Hitler and the Nazi forces, as Dunkirk touched upon, you know, obviously the British Expeditionary Force and many other Commonwealth nations pulled back and got back to the UK, and then there's only a small, what is it, 20 miles, is it, the English Channel?
22 miles, yeah.
You know, it's...
and they were all squeezed into a little tiny area between France and Belgium. Yeah,
yeah, and so the German forces massed in France and Belgium, and to basically Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, told Hitler that he could make air superiority for an invasion, so he could take the Air Force, the Royal Air Force, out in a few days, not really understanding the whole radar, and the 11 Group was fighter command, part of fighter command, and their tactics were to deploy very small groups of Spitfires and Hurricanes to break up large formations of German aircraft. So therefore, you didn't ever expose your entire Air Force in one hit to try and take out the other invading, you know, aircraft, the bombers, the Heinkels that were coming in. So the Germans had a lot of advanced techniques because they'd flown in Spain in the Civil War there, you know, the Condor Legion, so their pilots were highly experienced. But it was a New Zealander called Keith Park who was head of 11 Group, and he and the head of Fighter Command, Dowding, Air Vice Marshal Dowding, I think at that time, was they used radar and the whole defense network system to just basically try and break up the raids. But the raids were there to take out Fighter Command. The Germans were bombing Fighter Command airfields to break our ability to fight. And then they thought they could invade across the channel because it's only 20 miles. But so that was the setup for the Battle of Britain.
So What was the airspace, and how many airplanes would be in there in a given daytime? Was this all during the day?
It was all, yeah, during that period of time, the Germans were trying to starve the British by cutting off the convoys, which could resupply them, because obviously we're an island and so we needed those supplies. So the Germans started to attack all the convoys in the channels using Stukas, and that's where we used Hurricanes and Spitfires to attack those lighter formations. That was phase one. And then the phase two, which took place in August 1940, they started to attack fighter command, because the fighters kept popping up, and the Germans didn't know why the fighters always turned up in the right place at the right time because of the radar. They didn't truly understand radar or the cohesive plan that was behind radar. So then that was, I think, the August the 13th was known as the hardest day, where the Germans bombed the British airfields and there was huge losses, and they were trying to put the airfields out of action. But then, fortune sometimes just falls in your lap, and a Heinkel bomber got lost. It was trying to bomb the Thames Haven oil refinery, again to take out strategic materials and supply lines and things, and actually got lost, jettisoned his bombs over London, and at that time there was a we won't bomb civilians sort of agreement, if you like, general rule of warfare. So Churchill then sent Wellingtons, I think, to bomb Berlin, which was a huge embarrassment to the high command. So they switched their attack to bombing cities, which became the Blitz, which ultimately gave fighter command the reprieve to rebuild the airfields, patch up the bomb holes and things like that, and then launch the fighters. And I think on September the 15th, one of the veterans in the film that Matt knows, that's why I keep looking at Matt about this, but and you flew Tom Neal. He was a fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain in Hurricanes, and he said that he flew 4 times on September the 15th, and there were 2,000 aircraft in the sky over southeast England on that day.
2,000?
Mm-hmm.
So September the 15th was the day that the Nazis had said, this is the day we're going to invade. We will take the Air Force out today, and from that moment forward, the land forces can attack.
Because the weather would be too bad through the winter, so they had to make that decision. Operation Sea Lion was the operation to invade the United Kingdom, and that was September the 15th, was the make or break day.
So Matt, with that, when talking with some of these pilots who actually flew the Battle of Britain, how did they describe what it was like up there with that many airplanes? And how many times did they run into each other? It's a small space.
It's a topic that's covered very well in Dibbsey's film. So the best way of answering that question is to watch the film. But to have had some personal time with those guys and listen to how it felt as a 19-year-old to be with their great mates in the most fantastic machines, and to paraphrase Geoffrey Wellham, for him and 8 or 9 of his best mates to take off before dawn on one morning and watch dawn break with his mates on his wing, thinking, I'm just the luckiest person in the world to be doing this. And then within seconds to see the 50 or so fighters or bombers that they had to attack, and that complete juxtaposition of being in this one moment beautiful, beautiful environment, and the next, in his words, seeing things that I hope you never see in your life, and doing that 4 times or 5 times a day, every day. It's so difficult for us to understand what they went through, and what they went through at that age as well. We sit here as pilots who fly Spitfires. I think there's a really big distinction to make, that they were Spitfire pilots. We just commemorate them.
Dave, you're nodding your head.
Yes, for those young men, it wasn't just flying the airplane, it wasn't just a fight, it was an endurance contest.
Yeah.
They flew day after day, multiple missions, always tired and feeling half sick, and never enough food, never enough water, watching your mates get killed one after the other, making your own peace with death before it strikes you, because you're assumed that you wouldn't make it. And that went on for weeks and months until finally either you break down or you get rotated out. It was that aspect of it, the sheer grind over the course of months, perhaps doesn't get portrayed very often.
Yeah. Tom Neal, who we very sadly lost 10 days, 2 weeks ago, at 97, was the greatest living Battle of Britain pilot left alive with 14 victories. He spoke at an event we had, and he stood up and he said, I know we're here commemorating the victory, but it's very difficult for me to see it as a victory. We just didn't lose. How can I call something a victory when so many of my mates have been killed? And I thought, what can you say to that?
Dave, what is it about this airplane? Describe how it flies and why it was successful as it was in the Battle of Britain.
Well, the Spitfire does try to look after you. And if you talk to the veterans, they all get kind of a reverent tone in their voice, right, when they describe it. It has very good low-speed handling characteristics, so that if you're in a really tight turn and the speed's back to 125, 130, something like that, and you pull a little G, it won't just do a snap roll like some of the other higher, or perhaps like a Mustang will. There'll be a turbulent flow off the wing root, which will vibrate the elevator, and you'll feel that on the stick, and you just ease off a little bit, and you're flying again. And that's very nice. We use that, in air shows.
One of the veterans that I spoke to about combat in the aircraft said he got one victory without firing, without using. So he returned to base and his guns were full. The patches on the wings were untouched, and he claimed a victory. And the guy said, "Well, how have you done that?" And he was being chased by a 109 from 25,000 feet, and he slowed down and just turned tighter and tighter, and the 109 just could never get a shot on him until he got to about 4,000 feet, and the guy behind got frustrated, hard, flicked, and hit the ground, and the Spitfire flew away.
And the other aspect is, after a hard turn, the airplane still carries speed and accelerates quickly. There's some fighter pilots in the audience. Paul, hold up your hand. Speed is life when you're a fighter pilot, right? And something like the Hurricane with its great, big, thick wing, at the end of a hard turn, it's doing 110, and it takes a long time to accelerate. This, if you unload it and have the power up, the speed's back to 180 to 200 very quickly. And the other aspect I like of it is landing. You have to land this 3-point, and that's fine. But once you're on the ground, it tracks nice and straight. It doesn't challenge you. You obviously pay attention, but some airplanes are known to be squirrely on the ground, like the M109.
T6?
T6, yes. T6, a very good trainer. I'm almost ready for a T6 now, I think, actually. 109 pilots were scared to death of landing on pavement because of its terrible landing characteristics.
So I heard a statistic, unverified, that during the Battle of Britain, one in 3 Spitfires was lost in takeoff and landing accidents just because they were new pilots. 1 in 2 109s was lost in a takeoff and landing accident, to give you a sense of how difficult the 109 was to fly by comparison.
One of the, I spoke to one Battle of Britain veteran once, and he said that the Spitfire could turn so well, as you spoke to, and you could fight it to its limits because it was such a friendly airframe to fly. But the 109, because it had the slat deployment to make it turn, these slats would be sucked out by the airflow. Well, they could asymmetrically deploy, which would flick the aeroplane. And he said that he felt one of the major advantages during the combat throughout the whole war, because the Spitfire and the 109 were developed almost alongside each other into later marks and more powerful marks, was that the Luftwaffe pilots were slightly scared of their airplane because if they flew it to its limits, it could depart on them, whereas I think the Spitfire, being a nicer airplane to fly, allowed the Spitfire pilots that little extra either mental comfort or a few degrees of turmoil or what have you. So
how much do you all together know about this particular airplane? Dave?
This is a Mark 9, and for anybody who hasn't, aluminum and things, and it stayed there until 1981.
In South Africa?
In South Africa, a place called Swartkop. And eventually a collector found it there, and sure, it didn't really look quite so much like a Spitfire anymore, but it was still recognizably an airplane. And at that point, it started a long path. We took it over. This is the Mike Potter Aircraft Collection.
And tell me about Mike's collection and who he is, please.
Mike Potter is a gentleman who lives in Ottawa, Ontario. And he bought a Spitfire when he accumulated some resources in about the year 2000. He'd been a pilot on the side during his corporate life. And every place he took this Spitfire was a revelation to him, you know. Old men would come out dragging their grandchildren and great-grandchildren and then cry in front of the airplane, as you know, and the news cameras would be there and crowds gathered around. And he really was struck by the education and commemoration and inspiration elements of all that. So he started to buy more and more airplanes. And then he recruited a team, you know, to help them fly them safely, because they're not inherently safe, right? These airplanes are designed to attack, not to preserve the pilot. And they can bite you. So we put together a team, and some of that team is here today. Hold your hands up, guys. It's great to see you looking after the airplane here. I sure appreciate it. It takes a lot more than a pilot and a mechanic to keep these things going. And right now we have a Spitfire and a Hurricane under restoration. And we don't have one of those, but we have a Corsair Mustang P-40. We have a Lysander and a collection of yellow trainer aircraft. It's a big full hangar, and you're all welcome to come visit.
And where is the museum?
It's in Ottawa, but it's at the Gatineau Airport. Okay. Vintage Wings of Canada is the best way to search it out.
Is that a logbook?
Yes. Well, when we restore one of these airplanes, we have to paint it, right, obviously, and so we pick a paint job that commemorates some Canadian who flew them in battle, and it's obvious. Sometimes it's not a famous Canadian, it's someone just whom we admire. So this one celebrates the career of Arnold Roseland, a flight lieutenant in the Royal Canadian Air Force, World War II. And he was one of those typically devoted, committed young men, signed up at the beginning of the war, was a gifted pilot, so he was held back and became an instructor. He was frustrated by that, but he did his thing, he did his bit. Then he was released onto a squadron and flew P-40 Kitty Hawks in the Aleutians. The Japanese had invaded a couple of the Aleutian Islands, right, and there was a defense effort there in concert with the Americans.
Attu and Kiska.
That's right.
In fact, tomorrow morning at this time, we're going to tell the whole story of that attack on the two islands in the Aleutians. Sorry to interrupt, Dave.
That's good. And then when he was sent over to England in 1944, he fought from there in Spitfires, and then was dispatched into France, you know, when the first landing fields became available with the RCAF, and unfortunately died there just about this time in 1944. He took his flight of 4 down through a hole in a mostly overcast sky where he had spotted some German fighters below. And so they went shooting through this hole, and there were 20 plus 109s and 190s waiting for them. And at the end of that fight, his airplane engine was, it was shot up. And so he parachuted, but he was too low and didn't survive the landing. So we picked his airplane, and we commemorated that 424 Squadron RCF Y2K. So his son is standing in the audience, Ron Roseland Jones. And he brought his dad's logbook, and I flew it yesterday here at Oshkosh with me in the display. So we have his dad's DNA in our airplane right now.
Have you spent time to look through that logbook?
Yes.
What do you glean from it when you start turning the pages?
You know, it's amazing how many familiar things there are in a logbook like this, even though it's 75, 80 years later. For example, you opened a page and said, hey, that's my base.
Yeah, this aircraft flew where we're based in the UK. Yeah. Unbelievable.
Really?
West Hampton, now Goodwood, yeah.
Yeah, and the exercises that they're going through are the same ones we still teach pilots. And there's, information about cross-country flights. And And I looked through it to see if I recognized names, you know, famous names that he would have known in the training world and then operationally, and there are a few of those. And then, I don't know if you can see this or not, but the left-hand side is usually which airplane and the length of the flight right here, who, where. But over here are remarks about the actual dogfights, the bombing missions, who got shot down, personal remarks. And those are the most interesting. So I just wanted to say another, perhaps unfortunate, meet his dad. Oh. He was, well, his mother was pregnant when the dad went overseas, and so this is how Ron knows his father. So it's an honor to share this and the airplane with the family.
And what you suggested, all of you, about the emotionality that seems to go along with this airplane, this is just another reflection of that, how deeply emotional people are about the airplane and the people who flew it. So
it stands for freedom, you know, it really does. We're very lucky to fly it, and from a pure flying perspective, it is freedom. It's the most exquisite flying machine. But then you marry that with what it did and what it stands for, and you really do have perfection in the air.
Yeah. Dibsy, having completed, you know, your film, when you're listening to these comments from Dave and from Matt, how do you tie those remarks to what you have learned so deeply in making the movie?
Well, it resonates very deeply. I have always felt that, even through the stills period of my work, that the fact that we are lucky enough to have these aircraft restored and can see them and experience the noise and the sight of them flying is great. But we have to tie that to the history and the service and create a great understanding of the world we live in today is because of the events of that time period. And so the film itself is the stars of the film are the veterans, and then the Spitfire is just, one of the, Ant Palmo, the co-director, said that the Spitfire was built for cinema. You know, it does look, it's a beautiful airplane, but it has a beautiful lethality about it. You know, when we were filming it, the way it moves through the sky, it's like a shark, and then when you see them in 3 or 4, on its own, it's beautiful. With 3 or 4 of them, they look like they're hunting in packs. You get this sense of what it must have been like, you know, in some way back at that time, as Matt spoke about, you know, the fact that you're getting airborne with all of your mates and, you know, in these incredible machines, and then you're thrown into that experience. But I have to say that, you know, if you can draw attention to the veteran stories because of this machine, then, you know, the world's going to be a better place, because we have to learn from the history and the experience of the veterans. You know, they are wise, they were there, and, you know, they want us to change is, you know, one of the quotes from the film.
And what you're describing is the reason Warbirds here continues to expand, to try to tell these stories, because so little of this history is being taught in schools anymore. And if we don't do it, then who will? And fortunately, there are a lot of efforts today by various restorers especially, who are working with young people, with children in schools to get them interested, so we'll have new generations of people paying attention to aircraft, caring about aircraft, and keeping all this history alive. Because unless we reach the young people with it, it's going to go away before too long. Dave, do we know how many Spitfires are still in the air, still flyable around the world?
I think you could answer that better.
I think there's around 50. They built 21,500 of them, to give you a sense. But yeah, there's 25 or so in the UK, and the rest around the world. Good number in the.
Storing these aircraft.
Enormous.
Boy.
It's millions. It just is.
Yeah. So where to now with the Spitfire? I mean, where's it flown? Where can we see it?
Well, I'm on a 5,000-mile trip, so this is a non-flying, static, you know, non-aviation components sort of restoration, and just put it in in a museum. And so Mike Potter said, well, I'll take it over, I'll make the investment, and I'll make it a flying airplane, so we have a Spitfire that flies in Canada, if you like. You know, you'd have to sign it over to me, but I'll do that. And in return, I'll bring it back and show you this flying airplane. So in honor of that promise, which was made in 2008, I'm flying it out there from here. So westbound for me.
So you go over the Rockies twice.
Yep. Yeah, I'll be going northwest to the Mullen Pass, you know, Billings and Bozeman up towards Spokane. And then it'll be on the ground for, well, flying around Vancouver Island for about a month, and then bring it back before the weather changes in the fall.
What about here at Oshkosh? Are you flying it?
I flew it yesterday, but Mike is actually bringing his Beaver in later on today, which is in Appleton right now. He got caught with some weather and other problems earlier in the week. So I've kind of pushed him to fly the airplane. Mike should fly the Spitfire at Oshkosh in an air display. So he's going to do it on Thursday.
Great. Matt, what is this experience like for you being here at Oshkosh?
It's it's incredible. It's on a US scale, isn't it? Everything everywhere. I have walked as far as I can walk in every direction from this spot, and still I can just see aeroplanes and people having fun. It's fabulous, absolutely fabulous. We'll bring an aeroplane here one day, maybe next year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dipsy, last thoughts about this whole discussion about RAF?
Well, I'd like to mention the fact that there's a very famous poem by John Gillespie McGee, who was an American who flew for the Canadians and flew from in the UK, and he wrote a poem called High Flight.
How many of you have read or heard High Flight? Yeah, exactly.
That's not bad, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and an interesting thing for me is, some people don't know this, but he wrote that poem after flying a Spitfire Mark V. So that gives you some idea of what this airplane means to aviators. And in fact, after Spitfire, having made that, and Steve Milner, the British Film Company, and I are teaming up to actually make a film about McGee called High Flight, which will be out in a couple of years, because we want to film and create that experience for the audience of flying, and what that created in his mind, why he had to write that poem, and that was brought on by a Mark V. But and it is great to be here in Oshkosh. Like Matt says, I think if you walk as far as we walked around this site, you would fall off the edge of England, right? At some point, you'd fall off the edge of England, and there's aeroplanes still in front of you. So it's vast, it's epic. But also Matt does some great work in the UK where he trains people to fly the Spitfire with a two-seater, and I think that Matt took me flying, and that was one of the greatest flights I've ever had, and a unique privilege. But it might be interesting to let Matt talk to that.
Matt, I mentioned Boltby, your flight academy. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so we have a couple of two-seat Spitfires, a single-seat Spitfire, training aircraft, Chipmunks and Harvards, and a simulator that's built from just in front of the cockpit to just behind the cockpit, which is made out of pretty much all original wartime parts, sat in a 220-degree dome. It's the first of its kind in the world. What it enables us to do is take people really with little or no experience, put them through a program, presuming they've got the time to spend with us, and give them the opportunity at the end of it to fly a single-seat Spitfire. Most people that come to us with a lot more experience than none, and are going into the two-seater, into the front seat. They tend to do 5 to 10 hours with them based on experience, based on their abilities. We then put them into the simulator and run through all the sort of failures that we can't really check in the aircraft, see how they deal with them, build that kind of level.
So you have a Spitfire sim?
Spitfire simulator, yeah. And with, the grip fought in the war. It's not just a piece of plastic. It is a cockpit of a Spitfire built into a 220-degree visual dome that moves as well. So it's realistic enough for us to get a sense of how people will deal with the single-seater. And to be honest, the single-seater is slightly easier to fly than the two-seater. And if they've done that program with us and they've done well, they can then go and fly a single-seater up to 3 flights within 3 weeks of training with us around the green fields of the UK and over the White Cliffs. It's quite an experience.
Did you fly a senior citizen female in Spitfire?
I did. I was humbled.
Who was it, and what was...
Mary Ellis, what an incredible woman. I flew her twice, actually, but I flew her for her 100th birthday. And she doesn't have a stick, doesn't wear glasses, doesn't have an earpiece. We flew in formation for a while, taking photos of her with Dibsy. Dibsy got some fabulous photos of us with an aircraft that she'd signed as a young slip of a girl when she was delivering it around the UK. It was one of 500 Spitfires that she'd delivered while she was working as an ATA delivery pilot. Anyway, back to our flight, and post the formation bit, I was a little unsure where we were, so I thought now's a great opportunity to give her a go, and I can sort of look at my map and try and sort it out. And the aeroplane went from sort of bouncing around with my sort of inadequate flying skills to being rock solid as she took control. And she pointed us to sort of a feature and said, that's Thorney Island on the nose. I'll take you there, then all the way up round the coast here, pointing out all the spots. She didn't lose or gain a foot the entire flight. She then pointed the aeroplane back at our home base and said, Goodwood on the nose, over to you, dear chap, you better take us in. At which point, the oscillations started again. Unbelievable.
That's great.
And I've also, so flying her is incredible. I flew Tom Neal, who I mentioned earlier, in our aeroplane, and that was on the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. We amassed at Goodwood, with the help of Prince Harry and his involvement, we got 35 fighters, all Spitfires and Hurricanes, to Goodwood to do a sort of a commemoration flight around the UK. And I flew with Tom Neal in the back with 7 Spitfires and Hurricanes around me over the White Cliffs, just watching his face, trying to understand. I mean, I should have been looking at the other airplanes probably, but I could see in my mirror, just looking into his eyes and trying to have the faintest glimpse of what he must be thinking. It was a truly honoured moment. Certainly the highlight of my flying career, par none.
Dibsy, we have not mentioned this particular airplane, the Meteor. What is this plane?
Well, this is a Gloucester Meteor. This is a training version. I think it's the T7. It's the oldest flying jet in the world at the moment, I understand. But this was the first. This aeroplane effectively moved on from the Spitfire 14 and the later marks of the big piston Spitfire. You know, that's as the jet age came in, and the Meteor was the first Allied jet fighter in World War II, and was primarily used to. It never had a jet-on-jet combat with the ME-262 that's been documented. However, you know, it was very useful for chasing down the V-1 doodlebugs because it was very quick. Yeah. And so there's a twin engine. I think there are Neen engines in this aeroplane, but it flew in 1944 to 45. But I did know a chap who flew Lysanders, which was the slow little aeroplane that used to drop spies into France, and they took him from the Lysander, which flew. What speed does that fly at? Low end?
Yeah, 65, 70.
Yeah, into a jet. He went from the Lysander to the jet, but there was a space in the back of the cockpit, and he had a very trusty Alsatian that he used to keep around. And so he threw the Alsatian in the back because he wanted the Alsatian to be the first Alsatian to ever fly in a jet. And he did that on a sortie in England. And then I met a 262 pilot who I interviewed about 6 months later, and he said, did you know that I had an Alsatian and I put him into the 262 and took him flying? He must be the first dog to fly in a jet. And I said, well, I think you need to talk to this guy in England because he flew one in a Meteor. So, but I don't think they ever got worked out which dog was the first jet dog. But yes, that's it was the next phase of development for the RAF, moving away from the big pistons.
So, John Dibbs, Dave Hatfield, Matt Jones, thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
And now we'll continue. Here's Sam Bass, extraordinary aviator with 35,000 hours in the cockpit. Sam, take over.
Dave, can I get you to stand up here and just tell us a little bit about the Spitfire, the history of the Spitfire and horsepower and what have you?
It's got a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This is a later Rolls-Royce Merlin. It's a 60 series. And the earlier Merlins had a two-stage supercharger, but this one's got a two-stage, they had a two-speed supercharger, right? You could have high or low blower, the early Merlins, but this one has that two-speed, like a high and low gear, but also has two stages, like two separate impellers. So you could put a much more heavily charged mixture of fuel and air into the carburetor and then get more horsepower out of it. So it went to about 1,500 or 1,600 horsepower, depending on how much you push the throttle. And that was a big surprise for the Focke-Wulf 190s. They had been tangling with Spitfire Mark V's, which has the earlier engine, and they had an advantage. But once this engine was put in, you couldn't tell the difference visually, but all of a sudden, the Spitfire then regained the advantage.
Well, now some of the Spitfires had Griffin engines, is that correct?
That's right. That started with the Mark 7s and continued through the Mark 14s and then the very later Marks. And that's it's very similar. It's another V12, supercharged and geared, but more displacement.
It had much more horsepower.
Yeah.
Well, they had what, five bladed propellers?
That's right. You know, once you get 2,000 plus horsepower in one of these engines, you need big propeller blades to harness that. And then the gear legs, the landing gear legs on a Spitfire are not really all that long. So, you know, I have to take off and land this thing 3-point to be safe. And if you had 2,000 horse Griffin engine in there, the blades would be touching the ground. So they went through 5-bladed props and either 2 sets of 3 counter-rotating props, different configurations.
Okay, how about, tell us a little bit about the armament of the airplane.
There were different wings that could be attached to the airplane with different hard points, attachment points for the weapons. So this one is set up, this is a C wing, and the big gun barrels that stick out are for 20 millimeter. And the little ones that are almost the same width, those are capped, but those could be other 20 millimeter cannons. So right now this one's set up with 2 20 millimeters, and then the red patches are for machine guns. 303s in this case. And they just took a square of fabric, you probably know this, but they just take a square of fabric, slap some dope on it, and put it over the hole so that if they flew through rain or bugs or whatever, it wouldn't, mess up the guns. And then when they hit the firing button, they just shoot right through the patches. So the red patches are 303s. But you could have it with 2 50 calibers and 2 20 millimeters or 4 20 millimeters.
What was your duration of flight in this airplane? I was talking to another Spitfire pilot, and he said it had short legs.
Yeah, it's a very typical British pattern based on their geography, right? To develop an airplane that launches, climbs quickly, shoots, intercepts, shoots, comes back and lands. So the Spitfire's like that, Hurricane's pretty much like that, the Vampire was like that, even the English Electric Lightning is like that. So it doesn't have much range. That's a slim wing, and they had to fit in guns and plumbing and landing gear. So the fuel is held in a tank in front of the cockpit in the fuselage, and it's basically 90 gallons. And if you open up the throttle on this thing, you could burn 150 gallons an hour. So your range is really quite short. This particular airplane, since I'm flying it through Canada, big place, we have 4 bladder tanks set into the gun base. and I can get up to 3 hours safely, which makes a big operational difference.
That's probably long enough sitting in it, 3 hours.
Oh yeah, it's not
Particularly
designed.
Asia.
This one isn't bad for comfort. I've flown the Lysander, which is, it's like being in a steam bath. Very uncomfortable airplane, although fun in its own way. No, this isn't bad, but like you say, 3 hours is plenty.
All right, well, now, how long was this in operation with all the different countries in the world? Just a ballpark.
I think, well, 1938 was the first production one off the assembly line.
So it's probably, what, 40 years?
Not quite. Well, the Irish Air Force, I believe, operated some well into the 60s. And I don't know of any. Maybe there were a few holdouts in South America as well.
Yeah. Well, I sure do appreciate it. Thanks for your time. It's a beautiful airplane. We really appreciate it.
An honor.
Thank you, folks.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.